Hey guys, Bugcat7 here. Okay, it is Wednesday, July 3rd, 2019, and I'd like to thank you for visiting the Stonewall Research channel here on YouTube. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. And if you would kindly hit the like button, guys, that would be great. All right, guys. Well, this video is really about the core of my research here and related research about the stone walls of New York and New England, which is the biggest area of ancient man-made stone constructions on the planet. And I've gone over this on Coast to Coast with Michael Tellinger, who claimed that South Africa was, but this part of northeastern North America, okay, where the stone walls are, okay, this little known and under-researched part of the history of and archaeology of the Northeast here, that's just totally ignored and dismissed. And, some cockamamie story has been put out there since the very beginning that, the settlers and colonists built these stone walls, but they only built a small percentage of them. And the advocates for this, like the so-called expert Robert Thorson, okay, who's in his book Stone by Stone, which is just a totally cockamamie book. He did some good research figuring out the different types of walls that there are, but he claims the most primitive style ones yet were built by the colonists and settlers. And I go over this in my debunking series, basically, and I just totally rip apart all his theories based on my research into what his theories are in the book, okay? And here's a little picture of the area in Connecticut that I went to do my research in. This is a beautiful little area here with this sort of retaining wall along the brook here, all right? And it's just amazing. This is 5 to 6 feet tall, and there are just giant boulders in the bottom of this. Who moved them there and for what purpose? It's just, I don't know, but I'm sitting on a large stone in the middle of the brook there, just hanging out there. This is in my video series at Mallory, and see if we can find it here. Here's like the things that you find in the stone wall areas in New York and New England, often among these stone walls in the remote wilderness areas where, mainstream sees the walls there and says, well, obviously settlers must have been here, or they have no records of settlers ever being in these areas. They base their assumptions on the other stone walls throughout New England. You see, they have no hard evidence of that. But what my research shows and other people's research shows, like North Country Relics, for example, Brian Gigliotti. Here's Dennis D's site where he just shows this is an effigy. This is a serpent effigy, okay, in Eastern Connecticut. On Dennis D's channel, just has a whole series of these amazing stone constructions, and here it is. This is a serpent wall. That's just a effigy, okay, of a serpent done in this very flat stone in a particular style. Okay, so you'll find these things, these effigies, and at my site there in Connecticut where I did my research, okay, I found this giant Manitou head, but the place is filled with split stones, serpent walls, earthworks, effigies, cairns, mounds. The brook was engineered to be like a snakehead pyramid-like construction there. All sorts of things, massive earth-covered rock walls, openings in the walls, which is very unusual, but it must have been a common area. But you'll find these things there, and also at Jimmy's in Vermont, where I did some research up with Jimmy there, and it just so happens that these serpent heads recur in the walls all over the place there, and it's just a repeating theme. And it's my hypothesis that all of the walls are serpents or snakes, and the head with the eye of the serpent repeated in the walls over and over and over again, because all of the walls are serpents and snakes, okay? And also, while I was up there with Jimmy, just, independently, we more or less, just by observing and looking at all these different walls and constructions and dolmen up there in Vermont, and the areas that were cleared, we both came to the conclusion, me and Mallory as well, came to the conclusion that these cleared areas must have been cleared a long time before the settlers and colonists got there. And Charles C. Mann's book, 1491, just seems to corroborate and affirm many of the thoughts that I had about the Northeast here. And I had also the video on my channel with this native Iroquois professor from Cornell that tells us, little known historical story about George Washington sending agents up to along the St. Lawrence to burn these 500-acre farms that the Iroquois were managing up there. And that's, guys, 500-acre farms is nothing to sneeze at, even today, okay? And they didn't have any machinery, you see. But we're going to read from Mann's book because, I'm currently focused on that, and it talks about this area. Then we'll look a little bit at this area, and you'll see when you look at it why I might claim what I claim. And, even this could be seen, with the latest articles that you see about Guatemala, the so-called Mayan cities down there, which they probably aren't Mayan, but they say whatever they want. And, they're just megalopolises, just gigantic cities. And, I could have titled this video here, giant, ancient megalopolis of the Northeast, because that's what it seems to be. But in any case, let me just read a little bit from Charles C. Mann's book. I'm not going to read a lot, but from his book, 1491. And, this book was New Revelations of the Americas Before Columbus. And, in this book, Mann's more or less interviews some contemporary anthropologists and archaeologists that are doing work that, the old guard, their peers in the old guard, don't necessarily buy into their work, or it's, peer-reviewed studies haven't even been published yet on some of this stuff. Even, it's many years later. I think this was the early 2000s or mid-2000s that Mann wrote his book. But just some very interesting things were said in this book. And even on, the inside cover of the book here, it's an interesting thing they say about corn. I did a video about corn. Pre-Columbian Indians in Mexico developed corn by a breeding process so sophisticated that the journal Science recently described it as, quote, man's first and perhaps greatest feat of genetic engineering, unquote. Don't you find that fascinating? I did a video on corn. Corn can't grow without human beings, guys. Okay? Corn can't propagate itself without human beings. Period. End of story. Cannot grow in the wild. Cannot. Has to be managed by human beings. Any which way you look at it, to propagate and survive. I did a video on it. So, in any case, let me just read a little bit from Man's book here. He's talking about Cahokia. This is in this section of the book called Landscape with Figures. And he's talking about Cahokia and the mounds, etc. But he refers to the Northeast, and that's where my focus is. And let me just read a little bit from Man's book here, okay? We'll both read it together. We can see it here, okay? And it's interesting the dates they give here because we've seen in so many other videos the dates seem to be around this particular time frame that many of the civilizations of the past sort of, closed up shop, which I find very interesting. And it just so happens that, in doing this research, I came across this article or this mention of this volcano, okay, in 1257, right around this date, this gigantic eruption, which was bigger than, all of these, within the last few years, Krakatoa, all of these much bigger than those in 1257. So I just found that interesting when he mentioned these dates, you see. So, in any case, let's get back to it here. All right, so, and this is why I'm saying what I'm saying. Beginning in about 1200 A.D., according to Woods, who's an archaeologist, Cahokia's maize fields repeatedly flooded, destroying the harvest. So something was going on. The city's problems were not unique. Cahokia rise coincided with the spread of maize throughout the eastern half of the United States. The Indians who adopted it were setting aside millennia of tradition in favor of a new technology in the past. In the past, they had shaped the landscape mainly with fire. The axe came out only for garden plots of marsh elder and little barley. As maize swept in, Indians burned and cleared thousands of acres of land, mainly in river valleys. Okay, so that's just more or less an affirmation to what Jimmy and I both came up with independently, that these areas that were cleared farmlands that we even see now today, many of them were already cleared by the time the colonists and settlers got here. Okay? Cleared of all the big stones. So this whole story about this, sappy, over-romanticized story about, the settlers, toiling to clear the land so they could grow their meager crops, which they all had to leave in 1816, right in the middle of where Robert Dawson says all the walls were being built. They left in droves by the hundreds of thousands in 1816 after the year without a summer and coldest decade in 500 years. There was nobody living up there by 1816, just when Robert Dawson says all the walls were being built. Okay, so as many swept in, Indians burned and cleared thousands of acres of land, mainly in river valleys. Okay, so you see that there, mainly in river valleys. Pay attention to that, because that's what we're talking about up here in the Northeast to some degree. As in Cahokia, floods and mudslides rewarded them. How do archaeologists know this? They know it from sudden increases in river sedimentation coupled with the near disappearance of pollen from bottomland trees in those sediments. Between about 1100 and 1300 AD, cataclysms afflicted Indian settlements from the Hudson Valley to Florida. So isn't that interesting? Okay. These cataclysms were happening between 1100 and 1300 AD. Just when you hear many of these civilizations in South America, Mesoamerica, and apparently North America here just disappeared, suddenly. And they don't know why. But, trying to get to the bottom of it kind of maybe. Okay, this might be part of the story in this Somalis eruption, but other events might have been going on in the sky, such as electric universe events that we don't know about. that happened recently. Okay, so let's get on with this. All right, so apparently, the majority learned from mistakes. After this time, archaeologists don't see this kind of widespread erosion, though they do see lots and lots of maize. A traveler in 1669 reported that 6 square miles of maize typically encircled Haudenosaunee villages. That's the Iroquois, the Haudenosaunee. Okay, right up here in New York and New England. Okay. Some of the tribes of those nations, including the Algonquins and other tribes, did similar things. This estimate was very roughly corroborated 2 decades later by the Marquis d'Annonville, governor of New France, who destroyed the annual harvest of 4 adjacent Haudenosaunee villages to deter future attacks. Denonville reported that he had burnt 1.2 million bushels of maize, 42,000 tons. Today, as I mentioned in Chapter 6, Oaxacan farmers typically plant roughly 1.25 to 2.5 acres to harvest a ton of land-raised maize. If that relation held true in upstate New York, a big but not ridiculous assumption, arithmetic suggests the 4 villages closely packed together were surrounded between 8 and 16 square miles of maize fields, okay, that had already been cleared of all the large stone. All right? It wasn't the colonists and settlers toiling. Okay, that's an imaginary story dreamed up by people who don't know what happened, and there's no record of it. Okay, except from in Mann's book, we gathered that the colonists and settlers had no problem moving into native people's settlement areas real quick, like, because those were the best and choicest areas. Okay, with already cleared land and stone walls already there to demarcate it all. Okay, between these fields was the forest, which Indians were subjecting to parallel changes. Sometime in the first millennium A.D., the Indians who had burned undergrowth to facilitate grazing began systematically replanting large belts of woodland, transforming them into orchards for fruit and mast. The general name for hickory nuts, beech nuts, acorns, butternuts, hazelnuts, pecans, walnuts, and chestnuts. Chestnuts was especially popular. Not the imported European chestnut roasted on Manhattan street corners in the fall, but the smaller soft-shelled, excuse me guys, the smaller soft-shelled, deeply sweet, native American chestnut, now almost extinguished by chestnut blight. In colonial times, as many 1 out of every 4 trees in between southeastern Canada and Georgia was a chestnut. Partly the result, it would seem, of Indian burning and planting. Okay, so these native peoples were managing the land. They're doing this high level of agricultural management there in the Northeast on incredibly vast scales. Okay? It goes right along with my theory about how these people would have to have enough organization to get it distributed properly without people going out of control, getting out of hand. And these forests up here in the Northeast, according to what Mann just said in here, okay, that he reports from the current anthropology and archaeology, what was that these forests up here and fields up here in the Northeast here were anthropogenic forests and anthropogenic managed fields. With once maize was introduced, they just grew it everywhere on every square inch they possibly could. Okay? So let me read the rest of it to you here a little bit. Okay. Within a few centuries, the Indians of the eastern forests reconfigured much of their landscape from a patchwork game park to a mix of farmland and orchards. Who knows what time it was? I think it goes back thousands and thousands of years. Enough forest was left to allow for hunting, but agriculture was an increasing presence. The result was a new balance of nature, quote unquote. From today's perspective, the success of transition is striking. It was so sweeping and ubiquitous that early European visitors marveled at the number of nut and fruit trees and the big clearings, with only a dim apprehension that the two might be due to the same human source. So you see right there, big clearings, big cleared fields, already cleared of all the big stone, no toiling by the settlers and colonists. One reason that Bartram failed to understand the artificiality of what he saw was that the surgery was almost without scars. The new landscape functioned smoothly, with few of the overreaches that plagued English land management. Few of the overreaches, but not none. Cahokia was a glaring exception, but who knows what kind of catastrophes went on at Cahokia other than their mismanagement of agriculture. I don't buy into some of their theories anyway, because I'm going to tell you why in a minute when we look at this largest area of man-made stone or ancient man-made stone constructions. Okay, so just look at this. A catastrophic earthquake razed Cahokia in the beginning of the 13th century, knocking down the entire west side of Monk's Mound. In 1811 and 1812, the largest earthquake in U.S. history, abruptly lifted and lowered much of the central Mississippi Valley, as much as 12 feet. The Cahokia earthquake, caused by the same fault, was of similar magnitude. It must have splintered many of the city's wood and plaster buildings. Fallen torches and scattered cooking fires would have ignited the debris, burning down most of the surviving structures. Water from the rivers, shaken by the quake, would have sloshed onto the land in a mini tsunami. Already reeling from the floods, Cahokia never recovered from the earthquake. Its rulers rebuilt Monk's Mound, but the poorly engineered patch promptly sagged. Meanwhile, the social unrest turned violent. Many houses went up in flames. There was a civil war, Wood said, fighting in the streets. The whole polity turned in on itself and tore itself apart. Okay, so there's probably a lot more going on in that, with catastrophes and everything else, but this attempt to rebuild the mound there, but they couldn't do a good job of it. Well, it's because they didn't know how. Somebody else had built it, okay? But, man's not saying that in his book, but that's what I'm saying, okay? And the man doesn't say much in his book. He just gets the information from the archaeologists and anthropologists. That's why he's not proposing any theories of his own. He's just telling us about all the current stuff that sort of contradicts everything that came in the past. So let's look at this. Let's look at the largest area of ancient man-made stone construction on the planet, okay? And my research took me along the Housatonic River, which is a big, giant, long river there, okay? This is close to where Mallory is in Sherman, about 10 miles as the crow flies. But all of these areas, heavy concentration of walled areas along these waterways, and the Housatonic River is one of them. Okay, this is where the first hydroelectric dam was put in artificially created Candlewood Lake, which is right by Mallory in the Sherman, Connecticut. And most of the stone wall areas there are all covered in water right now, so we can't look at them and see what they're like. Okay, so the Housatonic River is approximately 149 miles long, so it's a huge, giant river. Massachusetts and Western Connecticut in the United States. It flows south to southeast, drains about 1,950 square miles of southwestern Connecticut into Long Island Sound. So, and also the Connecticut River, okay? Big, giant, long river, even longer, 400 miles, goes through 4 states, 5 states. Something like that, okay? It's the longest river in the New England region of the United States, flowing roughly southward for 406 miles through 4 states. It rises at the U.S. border with Quebec, Canada, and discharges at Long Island Sound, okay? So it runs like parallel to the Housatonic, okay? So let's look at this site before the time runs out here, because I want to show you it, Okay, and this is called the New Hampshire Stone Wall Map. It's Lidar imaging, okay, but this is enhanced. And the reason for the enhancement is these stone walls that are found on the ground here have been verified. So if it hasn't been verified, it's not on the map here, and there's lots of stuff that hasn't been verified. But it's very helpful in the sense that where they have verified it, these stone walls do not make any sense in the context of farming or anything else. In fact, it's hard to imagine what exactly they are from the incredibly complex patterns that they make and what relationship they would actually have to, people living there. By the amount of them, it seems that there was many more people living here, which is what Mann says in his book. At the time of the explorers, there was maybe millions of people here, and by the time the settlers and colonists got here, they were all dead from disease and everything else, 95% of them. So let's look in on this, okay? So all these pink areas represent the highest concentrations of stone walls at this level, but let's go in on it, okay? Because I want you to see. Okay, this is most likely all contiguous, and don't forget, it's just New Hampshire. Vermont and Massachusetts are working on it, I think, before they come up with their LIDAR imaging mapper. And Massachusetts already has one, but it's the standard one. There's no enhancements or lit up areas. You sort of have to make of it what you can, which is very difficult in some instances. And there's a lot more things, as I just showed you, from all these sites, Jamie's site, Dennis D's site, my site in Connecticut. There's many more stone things and constructions that are not walls that aren't included in these either. But let's take a close look at what these things look like. And this is all along the Connecticut River here that more or less splits Vermont and New Hampshire. Okay. And everywhere you see this pig, obviously from far away, we see the most concentration. And then we get closer in, you can see it gets very intense. And here, on the right-hand side here is where the Connecticut River here that splits Vermont and New Hampshire there. Okay. You start looking at the patterns of these walls and the concentrations of them, it gets nutty, and there's no explanation for it in any sense of anything. Okay, so some of these are incomplete, okay, and a small percentage of them were built by colonists and settlers, or even some of the old ones modified, but the patterns are very strange and they get all very intense. And I think if they were to complete all the mapping of this, they would find the stone wall are contiguous. They're like all interconnected and never ending. Okay. In, all of these states combined, okay, they're just everywhere. And this is one of the things that, Barbara DeLong puts forth, that it's an underestimate. It's more like 500,000 miles of stone walls in a lot of these areas, guys, in New Hampshire, Vermont, or whatever, in remote areas where no one is, okay, today. No farmable land, no nothing, okay, just a lot of forest and other strange things. And predominantly, a lot of these walled areas are around water, whether it be rivers or not. But you can see, looking at some of this stuff, okay, just does not make any sense. All right, and let's see if we go down here. I want to get to And, if you just keep on following the river here, it just shows more and more of these stone wall areas, and they're just wacky and for no reason. Walls that end, the uneven ones. I mean, it's just squiggly ones, weird constructions. It's just making it a lot worse for them to explain, what these things are. And in tiny spaces as well. Want to get down to where like Jimmy was in Vermont, because he's right on the other side of New Hampshire here, and there's a lot of walled areas on either side. And where I was in Bellows Falls, staying